Hello and welcome to Alfheim, a small section of a park which is going to feature two dueling terrain conforming inverts, and it's gonna have a general fantasy Elvish theme to it. As you might be able to tell from the title, it's heavily inspired by Rivendell, but it also has a bit of like neo-gothic, gothic revival and Art Nouveau kind of ideas behind it. And basically I wanted to start off with one of the scenery pieces instead of the roller coasters themselves, because even though the roller coasters are going to be the big focus of this park in general, I wanted to start off with the most prominent piece of the scenery, basically because it's going to be such a big prominent part of the scenery and basically just going to dictate what the rest of the theme is going to look like and how it's going to fit in with this. But I partly also wanted to do it because it's been a long time dream for me to actually build a proper castle in Planet Coaster. And by castle I don't just mean one of these fort castles or an actual functional defensive castle, but one of these really fancy ones, especially with a more fantasy touch to it that this one has. It's definitely not going to be realistic and it's not going to be very grounded in real life, but I'm going to build a castle over here. And it's pretty heavily inspired by Neuschwanstein, even though it has a different theme and style to it in general. It's got the same basic build-up of it. It's placed on a rock, but not just a very pointy rock, but one that's kind of more longer and elongated, and the castle is kind of going to be like Neuschwanstein in that sense as well. It's not going to form a perfect square or a circle, but most of it is going to be made out of these gables, with a slightly offset and rotated, pretty lengthy sort of base shape to it. It probably doesn't make much sense at the moment, but I hope it's gonna make much more sense during this video. What's pretty unique about this though is the way that I wanted to go about doing this, which also made the time-lapse pretty interesting. Basically the building is not going to be built in one go, kind of like what I'm doing at the moment, but what I wanted to do here is make separate pieces, kind of like it's a modular building system within the modular building system of the game itself. So I'm going to work on separate pieces for towers and balconies and roofs, that kind of idea. And only once all the pieces are finished, I'll put them together into the castle, which is going to consist out of these different combinations of pieces and different buildings to make it all work. So yeah, with that in mind, that is pretty much the idea, so let's get over to the pieces. The first piece that I wanted to make is one of the tower pieces. Basically the general idea is that I want to have some small towers, some medium-sized towers, and one big tower right in the middle of the castle that's going to be like the big icon of the castle itself. And I just made the very small castle very small tower really quickly. This is going to be one of the pieces for the middle largest tower. Actually, let me correct myself, I just made the medium tower piece, and this is going to be the bottom piece for the larger tower, which is going to consist out of two slightly different pieces just to make it a bit more narrow when it comes to the top of the building. And that's basically going to make up the core structure of the building, aside from the roofs, because I want to have the one main tower in the middle, then two medium towers around that, and four smaller towers around all of the sides of the building to make a nice progressive sort of triangular shape of the building in general, with a big tower in the middle and like slightly lower and smaller towers toward the side of the building. I also had to focus on these towers instead of anything else because, interestingly, this building is not going to have any dormers or turrets or anything like that, anything that sticks out of walls or roofs to make it more interesting. So it's going to have to rely on the details of the Gothic gables and on the towers on the sides to make the vertical details and accents and the general building a bit more interesting. And over here I'm basically working on the balconies for the main tower. It's not going to be simply be a tower because that would honestly be kind of boring, so I wanted to have two balconies, one sort of at a midway point just above the roof of the base of the building, and one which pretty much is going to be placed right underneath the spire and might like have a small bell at the top of the building. I'm still thinking about whether I want to have a bell or just make it a general little pavilion on top of the tower underneath the spire. But yeah, that's the general idea of what I wanted to do with those balcony pieces. Now moving on onto the spires themselves, which are made out of these blanks, which just work really well for this kind of thing. Since they're really small, I figured the texture works alright, because even though it is wood, it looks pretty alright from a distance, and kind of like one of these brown tiled roofs that you see sometimes with castles. And it was pretty much the most viable option of everything that's in the game at the moment, and give them a nice little rim underneath it, just to make that connection between the tower itself and the spire, and then that should be all fine. And give it a nice little point as well, since it is inspired by Gothic revival in general and Gothic and Elvish kind of architecture. I really wanted to focus on some of the vertical accents, especially on this building, since it's not going to be a very bulky or wide building. It's going to have a pretty small footprint. I wanted to really focus on the vertical elements to make it appear very large. So everything from the towers themselves to the spires on top of the towers is going to be pretty long and stretched out and tall, and basically this is going to be the largest spire for the largest tower, with a couple of Gothic ornaments on it as well. And moving on is the very small tower, which is going to be featured 4 times on the building, which is also just made out of windows. It's pretty funny actually, because these towers are made in a pretty simple way, just a bunch of windows with some of the concrete that I still needed to fill in the gaps between the windows and make it actually look like a tower, but it's not that necessary, since you'll see later on I'll actually fill those in with some white pillars to make the details come out a little bit more. Now the roof spire for the smallest tower was kind of annoying, because it's so small and I had to make it 1/2. Like usually I like to just make 1/4 and copy that over to save a lot of time. But since this is right on the middle of a grid like that, I had to make 1/2 and copy that over. And it pretty much looks like the other spires. There's not much interesting stuff going on with the roofs or the spires of the building, which is pretty notable. I didn't want to have it, well, distract from the details on the building itself too much, because the Gothic gables and the towers themselves are going to have a lot of detail and just be in general a pretty big mess of details everywhere, and I didn't want to make the roofs too clogged and make it just one big sugar-coated detailed building. So since the sides and the walls of the towers are already pretty detailed, I want to keep the roofs pretty simple here. Now this is going to be the tallest tower, and it's slightly off-center, a little bit tucked into the back looking from the front of the building, and a little bit toward the left as well, because I didn't want to make something that's symmetrical, but this still felt like the right way to put it into. It's also slightly toward the back of the building, because I wanted to have most of the weight and height located near the back of the building, which is quite similar to Neuschwanstein as well, just to give it that bit of an idea that it's actually sitting on a rock, and it kind of goes along with the shape of the rock that it's sitting on as well. And so I'll also have higher gables and higher towers near the back of the building, just to give it that more interesting shape. And as you can see, the white pillars, just to make the building come out a bit more. I was kind of worried about the very grey look of the towers before, so I tried to place a white pillar in the middle of it to make it white, make the details come out a little bit more and make it look more clean in general. And I'm really happy with how that look turned out, so that was pretty much considered a successful little experiment there, and figured I could just make all the towers white that way. And here you can already see the basic shape of the building kind of forming. There's 2 gables at the front of the building, which is kind of interesting. I wanted to have 4 gables to give it a sort of symmetrical look, so there's going to be 4 gables on all 4 sides, but they are going to be slightly offset with different rotations. It's not going to form a perfect cross if you look from upwards, and that's the general idea. But I also wanted to add 2 gables in the front, one a bit lower than the gable after it, just to make that a bit more interesting and really demarcate pretty clearly what's going to be the front of the building, even though I would say I tried to focus on all sides of this castle to make sure that it more or less looks good from every angle. And moving on, you can already see a lot of the building taking shape. What's really handy actually about making these separate pieces and kind of putting them together this way is that you still have a lot of leeway in how you want to move certain pieces, so you can like really precisely and without spending too much time on it, experiment a bit with the exact placements of different pieces. And even though the building is not even halfway done finished, you can already really see what it's going to look like when it's finished. And that's really what I like about, you know, some ways of going about building. It might not be the most efficient way to build things, but it's pretty efficient and you do get a good idea of what it's finally going to look like because you have the basic shape and, well, the basic roof structure of the building before you head into the details. So you can kind of go into the details of the building with the safe idea that it's gonna end up looking pretty good at the end. Just a few cornerstones over here because I did want to get detail in at every corner of this building, and I figured cornerstones are a pretty nice thing to add to a castle, and especially because I didn't really have anything else to fill it in with there. And I don't have any turrets or pinnacles or anything like that, which is kind of interesting. You do see them a lot on this type of building, but I wanted to keep them out just to make the building a little bit more clean and just let the towers do the work. I might still add some pinnacles and turrets at the end, but I'm really not sure about it. I like the look that it turned out with, even though it doesn't have that much detail as it possibly could, so I'll probably just leave it this way. Now, what is pretty noticeable is that I put these wooden balconies inside many of the details that I wanted to bring out a little bit more, which is a little bit weird. I wasn't too sure about it at first, but it really helps to bring out the objects where the shadows don't really work to bring out the details. And since the balconies which I use to get those details have the same texture as the walls that I placed them over, I figured it would be nice to place these balconies, wooden strips between the balconies and the walls, just to make the details come out a bit more because of the contrast in the colors. Now, moving on, I'm adding the very last tower of the building, which is going to be the last small tower. And here you can also kind of tell the sort of system to the building. It's a pretty random looking building with all the towers and gables, but here's where you can kind of clearly see the general cross shape of the 4 gables on all the 4 sides, and where you can see that the 2 small towers are located next to the 2 gables in the front and at the back. The medium towers are located right in a sort of diagonal line over the building, and the biggest tower is located just off the center, a little bit toward the left and a little bit toward the back of the building, which I'm pretty happy with how that placement came out for it. Now, for some more detailing of the building itself, I wanted to start off with a staircase, which is going to be the entrance to the building, and I figured it would be nice to have a red carpet roll out of it. Might not be the most realistic thing or anything, but I figured it would be a nice way to make this a bit more fancy, and also have these stairs come out a little bit more. Here the same thing more or less applied. I tried to have just the concrete roofs as stairs before, but you can't really like tell the different steps apart, and it just becomes this huge mess of grey in general. And so I figured it would be nice to add these little wooden accents on the top of each staircase, just to make it come out a little bit more and make all the steps a bit more clear. And what's also kind of funny about this is that because I have 4 gables on all 4 sides, I pretty much had 4 facades to finish on this building, but all of the 4 facades have like some slight differences and variations on the same theme. So they all have a sort of general first door and 2 windows on the second floor with balconies underneath them, but all of the different ways in which they're made and the details are all slightly different for the different facades, which felt like a fun thing to add in here. And what also makes the building come out a little bit more is I wanted this building to sit on top of a rock, much like Neuschwanstein and arguably also kind of the Disneyland castle, but I wanted to make it a really steep, rocky rock and not just make it come out of the foliage a bit, but really make it jump out of the general environment. And instead of just having a foundation underneath the walls like you would commonly see with castles, I figured that would be a bit boring. And so to make the castle jump out a bit more from the rock that it's standing on, I wanted to have this walkway alongside the entire side, which functionally is a good way to actually provide the entrance into the entrance of the building in the front here, but it also makes sure that the castle can kind of loom over the rock which is going to stand on top of, because these brick parts will slightly hang over the very steep cliff faces that the castle is going to stand on top of. I did change them a bit there. I took out a bit of time lapse there, since that was just an endless part of trial and error. Here you can see I kind of refined the brick pieces by adding some diagonal parts and making it recede back into the rock a little bit more, but I'm really happy with how that turned out. And now this is also kind of cliche, but I wanted to have a curved stairwell alongside the side of the rock, just to make sure that you can actually, you know, leave and enter the castle and that you're not just locked in there. So this is going to be the entrance, pretty fancy, and one of the things which is actually pretty mentionable, I should probably notice this, is that much of this project is going to be very terrain themed, or focused, I should say. Like, I'm going to be working with the terrain editor quite a lot because everything is going to conform to the terrain generally, and so I wanted to do that with this castle as well. So it's going to sit on top of rocks, which I am mostly going to use the scenery rocks for, but just for a bit of variation in the shape and texture, I figured it would be handy and good looking to start off with the base of the in-game terraforming and just place the rocks over that where I needed to get the general shape that I wanted to. But leave some of the in-game terraforming in there just to see those very slight hints of grass and sand and different rocky textures between the scenery rocks as well. And obviously it makes my life a bit easier because it's, well, it definitely saves a bit of time as well. And the rock kind of molds around the building as well. Like, it has a very subtle, more than 90-degree angle over here, so it really kind of looms over the curved staircase and really makes the building come out a bit more, because one of the things that's obviously really important about this castle as well is the forced perspective that it plays on. It's not that big of a castle, it's only about 5 tiles across in, well, the width of the building, but it is pretty tall, and because it sits on a rock, it really comes out a lot more and looks a lot bigger than it actually is. So I wanted to make sure that that rock would actually support it as well and not just be an awkward little hill. But really make it this very steep, dangerous looking rock. And that's a bit of adding some rocks over here, just to be able to support the path. I figured for a while I could support the path with terraforming as well, but just using the scenery rocks makes it a little bit more rugged than you can like really make it with the in-game terraforming. Like, it's a bit more rough and it has all these edges around it and makes it so that the rock parts, especially over here, kind of has more than a 90-degree angle underneath it as well, and really hangs over the rockwork underneath it too. And just because I had a bit of a gap over here and figured just rockwork would be a little bit boring, I wanted to add a bit of brickwork over here just to support that bit of path there. And get some fancy lights as well, because I definitely need to be able to light the way, because truth be told, I don't think I'll give guests access to this path. It's mostly just a decoration, because it is a pretty dangerous path. Like, the lights are pretty much the only way to show you at night where the path ends and where your death begins, pretty much. So I don't think I would let guests on a railing with no fence. The IAAP would the IAAPA, there we go, would not be able to actually agree with that. Wheelchair people can't even use this thing. Did I just say wheelchair people? Anyway, you get what I mean. Basically, it wouldn't be approved for a theme park. So this is all just scenery, and it's no actual path. Maybe it could be a fun thing for like behind the scenes kind of tours for the park. But yeah, that is all heavily off topic. Moving on to the foliage. I wanted to make the foliage very varied over here. Also, in terms of foliage, I'm pretty inspired by Nemesis, which also has some pretty dense foliage, which makes the area, well, really come alive a bit more as well, but also makes it much more dense and compact in terms of scenery. And while you don't really see it too much over here, since the coaster is not going to come too close to this castle, it's definitely something that I want to have throughout the foliage, and just to make that, well, continuous throughout the park. This is going to be more or less the standard for the foliage in the rest of the park as well. So pretty important actually that I wanted to get that bit of foliage over there right. Now that's pretty much the front of the building all done. So I just wanted to finish the back over here. It kind of went on to take a bit longer than I expected. I kind of hoped to finish this castle a bit faster than I'm doing at the moment, hence why this episode is a bit on the long side as well. But I really still wanted to finish the backside and not leave that as a job to finish in the next episode, because in the next episode I want to focus on you know what it's all about, the roller coasters, so I wanted to get it done today and figured, well, might as well do the backside and see how I can get that done. It's kind of a shame actually that, for me at least, every single facade that I made for these 4 gables, like every one felt a little bit better than the last one, and now it turned out that the facade all the way at the back and the one that you probably won't see very much is my favorite in the end. And this one I kind of like as well. It fits in pretty well with the rest, but it uses a different door and some different details around it, and there's quite a bit of like the Elvish idea behind it as well. Though I have to say, the reason why I wanted to go with a fantasy theme here is just because it's been kind of something I've been wanting to do for quite a long time, that I have a theme where I can just let go of all sorts of architectural styles and just do whatever I feel like is going to be fun and is going to look good. There's just a lot of freedom and fantasy in it, and it's that kind of thing which I really wanted to do for quite a long time. But I don't want to go completely fantasy on this. I've had the idea to go with floating islands or a really big park for quite a while and like make it on an epic scale. Something that's like really cool, not necessarily something that you would see in a theme park realistically, but just something that's really breathtaking and amazing. And it's that kind of fantasy which I figured in the end I wouldn't really go with, and just focus on fantasy as a building style instead. Even though there are definitely a few things that you can say about this park, because this castle already in real theme park terms would cost you millions of dollars. It's a very expensive thing to build, and the budget for this park has to be pretty massive. So I reckon if Alton Towers suddenly had a lot of money to spend, or Merlin, I guess they could make something like this, but it seems much more like a ride that Universal or Disney would make, except for the fact that it's gonna be, well, playing with hills in the area. So it wouldn't realistically be placed in any existing park, it's just still on the scale of an actual theme park, though with a few liberties to make it a bit more fun. It is kind of a fantasy after all, since it's a game, and you know, the game is kind of also meant to build what we don't have in real life and what we kind of fantasized about coasters and what we would kind of wish them to be like. At least that's kind of the appeal that I see in this kind of game, and what I wanted to go for a little bit with this build. But I do want to keep it close to realism, so it's not going to be enormous and it's not going to have any floating islands. Maybe at some point in the future when I have a really ridiculous idea again, but for the time being I wanted to make something that's at least within a range of suspense of disbelief, believable for being in the theme park. And yeah, that's basically what I wanted to do with this. Now, last but not least, I still had to finish the bit of rock work on the back here. This is going to connect to hills at the back of the castle. So the castle is not going to stand on like a standalone hill, it's more like a protrusion that kind of comes forward from the hills in the background. And the hills which the coaster is going to use, or the coasters are going to use, I should say, in the future, just to make sure that they kind of maintain their speed, because they are going to be very Nemesis-ish, in the sense that they are going to have a not so large lift hill that's going to go up a hill, and generally through the entire ride they just keep on going down to keep their momentum, keep the speed going through the entire ride, while they never actually come out of tree height limits. Because interestingly, Alton Towers, if you didn't know, has a tree height limit, and they can't build above the trees, except for Retail, which had to change its color scheme for it. And that's why Nemesis is, in the end, so awesome, I think, because it really uses the terrain to get these pretty good heights and inversions and curves and everything in, even though it never really comes very high off the ground. And that's the general idea that I want to go for with these coasters as well, except kind of like Dragon Challenge in Universal, they are going to be dueling. And that's the general idea of what I want to do. I wanted to say that in the last episode, but now, whoops, I already gave it away. But yeah, that's pretty much what you can look forward to, I suppose. Now, just finishing a bit of the last foliage, and I'm pretty much done. One thing that I still wanted to do is add a bit of planters here and there. Figured I would go with that little square thing first, but didn't really work out since I've already used those for balconies. And instead, I'm actually really happy with how this little wooden basket actually works. It might also pass as a litter bin, so I'll probably use that or some variation on the theme for litter bins at some point in the future. I do kind of like it. And I wanted to, you know, spruce things up a little bit, add some foliage to the castle, make it look a little bit more inviting than just the naked marble of the castle, or it's probably just stucco. It's stucco, yeah, I'm going with stucco. And place a few plants, especially alongside the doors. And that's pretty much it for the castle. So thank you guys for watching this episode. I'm running out of time lapse, but I still have a couple of interesting cinematic shots that I want to show off. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll leave you guys alone with the final cinematic shots and some music.